All right, we're going to continue on with part two. So this is January through May of 1844, or if you please, if you're following along, this is volume 14. I'm going to go through this whole thing in the next, few minutes, I hope. So we're going to start in January of 1844. And just to kind of bring you up to speed, again, we've had the Avery brothers kidnapped. We've had Porter Rockwell arrested. There was an assassination attempt on the former Missouri governor. They were assuming that the Mormons did it because the Missourians treated him pretty badly. And now we're going back and forth a lot, and you're going to see a lot of this with Governor Thomas Ford of Illinois, who was, by the way, an attorney and a judge. So he was actually pretty good, in my opinion, about how to handle all the legalities and the paperwork and all that kind of stuff. So, in my opinion, did a fairly good job. I know the Saints contemporarily kind of saw him as a traitor, but looking back on the history, I actually thought he did a pretty good job under the circumstances. So we get another exchange with Governor Ford seeking protections against Missouri and citing the kidnappings of the Averys and the recent release of Porter Rockwell as part of the reason why Joseph does not want to be a part of any extradition process. We then get a letter from Joseph Coe, and this gets weird. And we get another one around the same time from somebody by the name of Reuben McBride. So Joseph Coe, I'm sorry, is asking for money to pay a debt that Joseph Smith owes to him. However, Reuben McBride also sends a letter soon after that and explains that Joseph Coe is not paying his rent on the property that Joseph Smith owns. And he's trying to get possession of that land for himself by hiding behind this whole debt idea. Kind of dirty. So Reuben McBride is Joseph's land agent over in Kirtland, and Joseph Coe is trying to just basically swipe it out from under him and not pay his rent and all sorts of stuff. And it's very interesting. We're going to get more into this as the story goes along, but there's sort of this Joseph Coe, Reuben McBride telling Joseph two separate stories, and we'll get to that in a moment. Joseph fires back a letter to John Calhoun via the Times in Season, so this is very public. Very much disagrees with how the federal government can do nothing to protect religions against loss of life and property because they are citizens. We also get letters to Joseph about the Maid of Iowa, which is a riverboat that they used to ferry saints back and forth. And they also sold tickets to anybody else who wanted passage or freight, either way. The account books had some issues. No known response exists for this whole thing, but we also get some tense correspondence between Elias Higbee about his standing with Joseph, his opposition to plural marriage. He demanded a church court. He got one, but Joseph Smith and he reconciled, and so it was not a court decision after all. So a couple of things that we get going on there. We get a 24-page letter from Reuben Hedlock, the president of the British mission. This was addressed to the 12 and to Joseph, reporting their success in the British mission. There's numbers and tables showing members, showing donations, a host of other information. He had to report, and this is really sad, he had to report the death of two people that happened while they were being baptized. One is Sarah Cartwright, who was swept away in a river current. So she's getting baptized, and apparently they lost grip of her or whatever, and she got swept away in the current and drowned. And also another priest, kind of a little bit more north of here, drowned while he was performing baptisms in a different river. So Sarah's husband and the baptizer, the one that was baptizing Sarah and her husband, were actually put to trial, even though they desperately tried to save her. They tried to get in there and grab her and save her, but they just couldn't do it. They were acquitted for want of witnesses, but that was kind of a sad story shared in this very long letter. And then after this, we get more into tables for attendance and so forth in a very, very long letter. But I just thought that was kind of a remarkable story, and something I'm grateful for today is that we teach people how to swim now. That used to not be a thing, especially for women, and a very dangerous thing at that. So apparently that's what happened to Sarah Cartwright getting swept away. Very sad story. Moving on from this, we also get a very long poem from somebody by the name of Stephen Ross on the 15th of January. This was a shoemaker, and he was the branch president over Newark, New Jersey, and came to Nauvoo with his family. But like a lot of the saints, including Stephen, he couldn't find work in Nauvoo, so he moved to St. Louis to find work. And so he was in pretty bad shape financially and had some physical, sort of medical issues, which is all described in this poem, which is 3 pages long. So I will commend you to that poem if you really want. But yeah, thought it was interesting that he wrote this poetry about his plight and where he was. No known response to that is found. And I like to say that, I mean, obviously, if you're mailing a letter back to somebody and that person doesn't keep it and it doesn't come into the hands of the Joseph Smith papers, it doesn't mean that nothing happened. It's just, of course, there's going to be a lot that we don't have anymore. All right, we get letters back and forth about Joseph's property in Kirtland, so we're getting into this again. Joseph Coe owes Joseph Smith rent. Smith is now directing Reuben McBride to evict Coe and get his rent money. Joseph also set up an indenture for the Nauvoo house, the idea being that a few rooms were for the Smith family and the rest would be let out like a hotel. So that was the intention. Joseph Smith has a home of his own at the time, but he was going to move into the Nauvoo house when it was completed. And this whole idea of some of the rooms being for Joseph and some for a hotel is all according to the revelation to build the Nauvoo house and the detail about stock and so forth, all that kind of stuff. Now it is all in legal form. So we've done that. Then we're getting some reporting on activity in Washington trying to get politicians and candidates for president to try to find favorable attitudes towards the saints. They're looking through all of these different candidates for president, and we can't find any. And hold that in the back of your head for a little bit. Tons of land deals, lots of licenses for preaching and callings, a host of other documents that we are totally skipping. And then we get to February. It comes along, and we get a notable publication called The Views of the Powers and Policy of the Government of the United States by Joseph Smith. My gosh, they loved long titles back then. But anyway, Views of Government is what I'm going to call it. Anyway, this was a pamphlet. It's printed in Nauvoo, and it was sent out to various places. The Joseph Smith Papers describes this as a duodecimo sheet. So what the heck is that? I found this from biblio.com. It says, a duodecimo is a book approximately 7 by 4.5 inches in size, or similar in size to a contemporary mass market paperback. It also called a 12mo. Duodecimo comes from Latin and refers to the practice of taking a standard printing sheet from a printing press and folding and refolding it until the pages are at the desired size. A duodecimo page is 1/12 the size of the original printed paper. Now, that's probably detail that you don't care about, but I just think it's funny. The next time you hold up a paperback book, a standard paperback book, I've got a few books here, of course. You are looking at a duodecimo format. Take that for filling in the history. Boom. Anyway, and here's an example I forgot to show you from Edgar Allan Poe. This was an example of a duodecimo. The Poe used this particular format. Anyway, moving on. This document is also Joseph Smith's first foray into being a candidate for the President of the United States. That's right. If you didn't know that, Joseph Smith was an official candidate for the presidency of the United States in 1844. From the historical introduction, we get this. Joseph Smith agreed to run for president on the 29th of January, 1844, at the behest of other church leaders who had determined that it was in the best interest of the church and its members to support an independent candidate in that year's presidential election. That same day, Joseph Smith described to Phelps his opinions on the powers and policies of the federal government and instructed Phelps to draft an address to the people that summarized these views. Even at a time when presidential hopefuls were increasingly involved in electioneering efforts, it was a bold step for a candidate to publish a campaign pamphlet he had written, whereas other candidates could publicize their respective political positions in congressional speeches that they were confident would be reported in newspapers throughout the country. Joseph Smith did not enjoy such a national public forum. That is an understatement. So yeah, this duodecimo turns out to be sort of the very first foray into Joseph Smith running for president of the United States of America, and that becomes a pretty big portion of this. Joseph emphasizes that the United States in this document has had great moments, But Van Buren did not want to protect constitutional rights, and Harrison died so shortly after his election, and John Tyler was making things worse. So Joseph proposed, quote, reform, including constitutional, economic, and social measures, and focuses on minority rights, a national bank, the criminal justice system, the abolition of slavery, and territorial expansion, unquote. Lots of stuff and kind of modern thinking stuff. Joseph thought that a national bank with branches around the country with a national currency, by the way, that's how it works today. We have the Federal Reserve branches throughout the country and a national currency. Just pointing that out. Joseph thought that prisons, focusing on reforming prisoners, was misguided. Thought that was interesting. He also advocated for a phased-out approach to slavery by paying slave owners from money made on Western land sales. So as the United States would expand out into the West and sell land to people, they could use those proceeds to pay slave owners for their slaves and phase out slavery from the Southern states, rather than just having it outright, at the end. I think Joseph was trying to stop the Civil War from happening. But anyway, Joseph Smith actually thought the U.S. had every right to expand into the West and annex Texas because there was a lot of fear that the British would actually take over Texas. And I would also add to this Oregon country, but he didn't mention that. He mentioned mostly Texas. So very interesting, especially considering in today's views and sort of our ability to look back, the fact that, the European immigrants, the not Native Americans would be, sort of blasting away at Native tribes as they moved west. The fact that Joseph was in favor of that is interesting, especially considering he had a really great relationship with Native tribes and told them not to give up their lands. So I don't know. Maybe he was thinking we'll just kind of fill in the gaps around where the territory from natives already was. Not really specified here, but that was his position. John Taylor winds up printing 1,500 copies of this. They were mailed to the White House cabinet members, to the Supreme Court's 9 justices, senators, representatives, the governor of each state at the time, editors of a number of newspapers, several postmasters, and a few other people. It was also printed in the Times and Seasons and in the Nauvoo Neighbor, and missionaries were then sent out to try to gain support for this run for the president. Most of all of this was dismissed or treated mostly with contempt, which is not too surprising. They were kind of mocking Joseph, and what do you know? And, you're the mayor of some small town, or you're a wacky prophet, or whatever the case may be. But it was not necessarily met well, and we'll see that with a couple of newspaper publications coming back in an unfavorable way. But this mission to sort of get Joseph elected as president is what a lot of the 12 went off to do, while a lot of things disintegrated in Nauvoo, and they were sort of kept safe by being away. They were called back slightly before the time that Joseph was shot, but anyway, that's what they were doing, and that starts with this duodecimo. Anyway, we after this, let's kind of move on from this now. A meeting is held after this publication began to see if the saints still supported the idea of this candidacy and so forth, and all was in the affirmative. So everybody felt Joseph Smith should definitely run for president. And this is not just, it was a majority of church members, but there's a lot of people at this point that start entering into the picture that are not members that are still supporting these efforts, which is kind of interesting. And we'll get into that here very soon. We get several land deals and letters back and forth. We also get a letter from Lyman White and others on the 15th of February talking about success in Wisconsin Territory with missionary work, the saints, and on getting lumber for the Nauvoo Temple. This was all part of a mission of sorts to Wisconsin Territory. However, the lumber enterprise was actually so successful, and they had so much lumber and timber that they needed for the house of the Lord, or for the temple and for the Nauvoo house, rather, that they were actually advised to move on to Texas. We have enough wood, so let's move on to Texas and do some proselyting efforts there. And I think this was sort of their maybe we're going to go to Texas. We're going to leave Illinois and go to Texas. But, we get another very interesting letter from somebody by the name of J.J. Lugenbuehl on the 15th of February, asking if Samuel C. Brown was authorized by the church to preach in New Orleans, or New Orleans, if you prefer, which he was not. So this letter is actually from a non-member, and the name of his church was actually the German Protestant Orthodox Congregation of Our Lord Jesus Christ and Savior. Very long names back then. Anyway, Brown went off and published a paper called The Mormon Expositor in Baltimore after he got busted and cut off from the church. And JJ was like, "Is this guy supposed to be one of yours?" And he got a letter back that said, "No, he is not." But started his own little thing called Mormon Expositor, not to be confused with Nauvoo Expositor, which is a whole other paper. But that did not end well. Anyway, somebody wrote a published response to Joseph's views of government and suggested that the Mormons are the worst and probably made all of the persecution stuff up. They didn't want to leave their name or address on this one. But we get something similar in the Warsaw Signal asking if Joseph was to be president, would he punish Missouri for what they did and cast out all anti-Mormons from the country, and sort of made a mockery of it. So we get a lot of that. That's kind of the kind of response that Joseph got from this. However, what I did find funny is that Joseph gets invited to a bachelor party. No joke. Here's the invitation. Bachelor party. He nor Emma went to this party, but apparently it was held in a nice place and somebody was getting married, and I'm not sure what bachelor parties were back then, but the invitation's really pretty. So there you go. That's not the only summons he gets. He also gets one on the 24th of February for a lawsuit by Amos Davies, who had been entangled in a few battles where Joseph presided, as sort of the mayor and sort of over the court of things against Amos at the time. Anyway, Amos wanted $300 in damages, never got his money because Joseph was murdered before it actually got to go to trial. And on top of this, we are getting arguments over who owns what land in Kirtland in connection to that Joseph Coe issue and rent and all that kind of stuff. And so Reuben McBride's kind of come back and like, how do you want me to handle this? What are we going to do here? So a lot of that fighting is still going on. There are quite a lot of discourses that we get. A lot of it has to do with wharfs, property, boats, and other practical matters. A lot of that's what the discourses are that we get in Volume 14. Willard Richards records this on the 7th of March, 1844. He says, "I do not care half so much about the presidential election as I do the office I have got. We have as good a right to make a political party to gain power to defend ourselves." So, may it let you know how seriously he was taking running for the United States presidency. He says, "I don't know if I really care about being president as much as the calling I already have, president of the church, prophet, seer, revelator, mayor, lieutenant, governor, pick your poison." But anyway, apparently it was really him trying to put the word out there of like, we have the right to defend ourselves, and if it means that I have to run for president to do that, then I will. So it's kind of interesting. Wilford Woodruff wrote the same thing in a different way in this in his version of this discourse. It says, "As to politics, I care but little about the presidential chair. I would not give half as much for the office as I would for the one I now hold. But as the world have used the power of government to oppress and persecute us, it is right for us to use it for the protection of our rights. When I got hold of the Eastern paper and see how popular I am afraid myself that I shall be elected. But if I should be, I would not say that your cause is just and I could do anything for you." So that's a little dig at Van Buren. He's like, well, I don't know if I'm going to win, but if I do, I'm definitely not going to use the words that guy said, which was wrong in his opinion. So there you go. We get a letter to Missouri citizens about getting ready to repay the Saints for their losses and the atrocities they pulled on the Saints in 1839. So this is entitled "A Friendly Hint to Missouri," and it is a very direct call to repentance, to say the least, but it is couched in very forgiving language, actually. So this is not some, which disappointed me a little bit, but it's not some sort of a 19th century insult rant. It's actually like, guys, you did wrong. You really need to make it right. You need to make it right, or else you will be held accountable for this. But that's a letter that is published out and sent. So there you go. We get a discourse and sermon from Joseph Smith that he admonished his listeners to write down. And so because of that, we get 6 versions of this. The 2 points that are interesting are that Jesus would not return in the next 40 years for certain. So Definitely no second coming before 1884, which perhaps I should say did come to pass. And that he would not appear in any year that a rainbow has been seen, which is interesting. He also spoke a lot about the sealing power that Elijah restored to the church today, the doctrine of having a calling and election sure, and how to fall from grace by blasphemy against the Holy Ghost. So here's what we get from the discourse about the second coming from Wilford Woodruff's account. And I quote, I have asked of the Lord concerning his coming, and while asking, the Lord gave me a sign, and said, in the days of Noah, I set a bow in the heavens as a sign and token, that in any year that the bow should be seen, the Lord would not come, but there should be seed time and harvest during that year. But whenever you see the bow withdraw, it shall be a token that there shall be famine, pestilence, and great distress among the nations. But I take the responsibility upon myself to prophesy in the name of the Lord that Christ will not come this year, as Miller has prophesied, for we have seen the bow. And I also prophesy in the name of the Lord that Christ will not come in 40 years. And if God ever spake by my mouth, he will not come in that length of time. And Jesus Christ never did reveal to any man the precise time that he would come. Go and read the scriptures, and you cannot find anything that specifies the exact he would come, and all that say are false teachers. So who are we talking about here? This Miller guy saying, hey, we're going to have the second coming. Well, this is William Miller. He was a Baptist preacher who actually went off and founded his own faith called the Advent faith, which was later renamed. He prophesied that the second coming was going to happen on this particular date, and I believe he took that from the prophecy of Daniel in the Old Testament. Anyway, that date came and went. Nothing happened. And so they renamed the religion into what is now called the Seventh-day Adventist Church. If you've heard of the Seventh-day Adventists, that is William Miller, and that's who Joseph Smith was speaking to here. And Joseph is basically saying, nobody knows. It's not in the scriptures, like nobody knows. All right. Let us get into something very, very interesting and something that will be very critical to the church throughout most of its history, even well into Salt Lake, and it is called the Council of 50. So we get the minutes of a meeting on the March 11th, and it says this. He said he had long desired it, and now inasmuch as it had been proposed to organize this meeting into a council, he was in favor of its being organized on an eternal principle after the order of God, every member of it to be bound to eternal secrecy as to what passed here, not to have the privilege of telling anything which might be talked of to any person, even to our wives. And the man who broke the rule should lose his cursed head. He finally offered this as a resolution, which was passed unanimously and became a law of the council. President Joseph gave such instructions on many subjects and laid down the order of the organization after the pattern of heaven. So this council would actually tend to civil affairs, spiritual affairs, and eventually manage the saints' migration to the West, as well as organizing efforts in Salt Lake for a number of years. So this Council of 50 actually became a pretty big deal. And I will just point this out. Eternal secrecy was something very, very seriously held by the church until so recently. I will hold up the book. If you're ever looking at the Joseph Smith papers, one of the series only contains one volume. There's no series of volumes in this. This is called the Administrative Records. This is the Council of 50 Minutes, and this goes from March of 1844, where we are here, all the way to January of 1846. There's 3 books in it, and they're all here. And the fact that the church would share these and publish these was a major big deal. I believe, and this may be apocryphal, that even Gordon B. Hinckley, who was later a president of the church, when he was an apostle, he was writing a book, and he wanted to look at the at the administrative records. And he, as an apostle, apparently had to have some security people like with him watching him do it. They were really tight about this. So it was very new that the church would actually allow this to be printed. I would include this with the seer stone that you saw and the Revelations and Translation series. Like, there's just a lot of stuff that the church is a lot more open about than the eternal secrecy that the Council of 50 started out with. So there you go. We'll get into that a lot more. So there are some authorizations, especially for Amos Fielding, who directed the acceptance of tithes and as well as supervising much of the immigration from England to the United States for the church. So a very important person, Amos Fielding. You have a drawn seal of corporation there, which is, to me, personally not very convincing, but I guess it worked for the time. So that's a big deal. This is the man who ferried a lot of ancestors of current Latter-day Saints from England all the way through to, Nauvoo, Illinois, and I would argue beyond due to the Salt Lake Valley. All right, we get a blessing on the 15th of March to John and Catherine Wilkie. And I will hand this one to the historical introduction from the Joseph Smith Papers. It says, on the 15th of March, 1844, Joseph Smith gave a blessing in Nauvoo, Illinois, to church members John and Catherine Payne Wilkie in relation to a sizable contribution they made toward the construction of the temple in Nauvoo. As the temple recorder, William Clayton kept a record of all tithing donations, the express purpose for which at the time was to fund the construction of the temple, in a large ledger book entitled The Book of the Law of the Lord. And some of our revelations came out of that. When a donation or consecration was of unusual interest, Clayton sometimes noted this in the ledger. If the contribution represented a considerable sacrifice on the part of the donor, for example, on rare occasions, Clayton inscribed blessings given to donors for their faithfulness. So that's what we have. During his visit to the Wilkie home, Joseph Smith discussed the principle of consecration and how to realize the fullness of the blessings of the celestial kingdom. Wilkie then donated $300 in gold and silver and indicated that he intended to pay more, quote, as soon as he could get matters properly arranged, unquote. After receiving this donation, Joseph Smith pronounced a blessing upon the Wilkies, and the blessing states thusly. The president then pronounced a blessing upon him, John Wilkie, and his companion, that they should have the blessing of God to attend them in their basket and in their store, that they should have the blessing of health and salvation and long life, inasmuch as they would continue to walk in obedience to the commandments of God. May the Lord grant his spirit and peace to abide upon Brother Wilkie and his companion through the remainder of their days. May their hearts expand and become enlarged to receive the fullness of the blessings of the kingdom of heaven. May they have the light of eternal truth continual springing up in them like a well of living water. May they be shielded from the powers of Satan and the influence of designing men, and their faith increase from day to day until they have power to lay hold on the blessings of God and the gifts of the Spirit until they are satisfied. And finally, may they live to a good old age, and when they have lived while they desire life, may they die in peace and be received into the mansions of eternal life and enjoy a celestial glory forever and ever, even so. Amen. Okay, after this very nice blessing, which I thought was very nice, we get another memorial to the United States Congress, and this is written somewhere between or probably during the period of the 24th to the 26th of March. This time it is originating from a little group called the Council of 50, which we just saw organized. This memorial requested that Joseph Smith actually become a part of the United States Army that would protect travelers migrating to the farther western part of the United States. This memorial is actually what you're looking at here, is actually held in the National Archives for the Senate records. It made it to the Senate by James Semple, who presented it to the Senate on the 6th of May, and it was referred to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and kind of fizzled out. So you're going to hear a lot about this, but that's the gist of it, basically. James Semple was the one that got it read on the Senate floor, and in the middle of that, he was told, we don't want to hear this, like these Mormons, we don't want to hear about it. And so it sort of got shot down, and they sent it to committee, and then it just died. But what you'll see is that Orson Pratt and Orson Hyde actually go to Washington and try to get this memorial through. Orson Hyde gets into some trouble. Anyway, we'll get into a lot of that, but this is the memorial that they're talking about. And it was not to be modified in any way, which we will also get to in a moment. So the last thing we get for the month of March, March 26th, in fact, is a letter from an anonymous person published in the Nauvoo Neighbor asking for the views of government pamphlet, and implies that Joseph would be a great candidate because he hasn't been entangled in politics as the others have. And so it looks like he's got a few fans out there, at least it would seem. So moving on, we get April 4th, we get a meeting to further establish the Council of 50 and draft a constitution and continue their exploration of Western sites for the saints outside of the United States boundaries. So Texas would be one of those. Now, in the middle of all this, the Potawatomi tribe appeared again and asked for help on giving up more lands to the United States government, and Joseph agreed that they do need to stand firm but also peaceful, and that the saints were on their side. And once they left, we see the group discussing the politics of going to Texas or Oregon, which were both a risk to becoming British territories. And if you don't know your U.S. history, Texas was annexed by the United States, and that has some tensions to it even to this day. That's why it's called the Republic of Texas. And then Oregon country was kind of owned by the British, and then the U.S. just kind of took it over. What that is. Now it's going to be notable to see where Oregon territory is and where the Saints wound up in the Salt Lake Valley. So basically, they almost went to Oregon territory, but because the U.S. had taken it over, they didn't want to live on U.S. soil. That's how bad things were. So they stopped in a little place called the Salt Lake Valley in present-day Utah. So this particular draft of Constitution and these minutes come from a volume of Council of 50 Minutes were intended to be very secret so as to protect the group and their functions, but not to fear. These were kept from the eyes of anybody until the Joseph Smith papers gained permission to publish them. However, all the minutes were supposed to be burned, and instead of burning them, they were actually buried in the earth. And then after Joseph died, they were sort of dug up and preserved. So that's why we have them today. So very interesting read. If you're into that sort of thing, you can get sort of like the shopping list for what you need to put in your wagon to go to Utah, for example. That is in the Council of 50 Minutes. The administrative records that I'm holding up here, I think it is the Brown series, if you will. Anyway, beginning and the end, all in one volume. Then we get one of the most important discourses that Joseph Smith ever gave. This is King Follett. This is the name of the man. He doesn't have the title king. His name is King Follett. Passes away, and Joseph is too sick to preach during his funeral on April 6th. He is recovered enough to preach on April 7th and gives this great couplet. As man is, God once was. As God is, man may become. So this was a enormously powerful discourse that he gives. Joseph does preach to the public, and it is published in the Times and Seasons, that God was once a man and lived like us and eventually progressed to become our God, and that we are his children. And this earth was created for us to advance and progress to become gods as well, to the point of like creating worlds and populating them for the same manner. And so it goes. This is a really big deal, and such a big deal that I actually did an entire episode on just this discourse. It's episode 16. It was done months ago around the Easter season, and my attempt was to correlate it to a big teaching on resurrection and the full implications of what the atonement of Jesus Christ means for Latter-day Saint theology. So the link is in the description if you want to take a look at that. It is, lengthy. I'm not going to get into it today, but it's on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Podcasts, just like all the rest. But the link is in the description. The next day, which is the 8th of April, we get another general conference of the church, where Joseph gets up and intends to preach a lot more about work for the dead and the plan of salvation, sort of continuing what he said the day before on the King Follett discourse, as we call it now. But he was still kind of under the weather, so he did not speak to that, but he did speak for almost 45 minutes, which when you're sick is quite a long time. Not that I've ever done that during filling in the history. That would be silly. Anyway, there are 4 accounts of this discourse from Thomas Bullock, William Clayton, Willard Richards, and Wilford Woodruff. Lots of W's up in this business. William, Willard, and Wilford. The historical introduction says this about it. It says this. Instead, he made a proclamation to the church's elders that modified the Latter-day Saint practice of gathering. Previously, Joseph Smith had instructed the saints to gather in either Hannock County, Illinois, or Lee County, Iowa Territory. Stakes outside of these counties had been discontinued in 1841, although branches of the church continued to function in various parts of the United States. Later in April of 1843, Joseph Smith counseled the saints to leave Iowa Territory and settle in Illinois. In this proclamation, Joseph Smith explained that all of North and South America constituted the land of Zion. He also taught that the Nauvoo Temple was the necessary place for the saints to perform certain sacred ordinances. After the elders received these ordinances, they were then to build a congregation and establish stakes wherever people received the gospel. Converts, moreover, were not asked to relocate to Nauvoo, but would come to receive their temple ordinances and then return to their homes. Joseph Smith stated that this proclamation was the greatest ever made, while Apostle Brigham Young later called these pronouncements a perfect sweepstakes and a perfect knockout to the devil's kingdom, devils being crossed out. Once Joseph Smith concluded, he requested that George J. Adams speak, having previously instructed him on what he should preach. Adams' remarks focused on the literal establishment of Zion and the salvation of the dead through vicarious ordinances. So this is a gargantuan shift and how the church operates today. If you join the church, yes, go to a temple and receive your ordinances, but then go back to where you are. And if there's enough of you, you get to have a ward and a stake and all sorts of stuff like that. So that is this. So I thought that was worth reading. That is a major, big, huge deal. I would also say, too, that the whole idea that all of the Americas, North and South America, Central America, all of the Americas, according to Joseph Smith, are what is termed the land of Zion. So technically speaking, according to this then, we're not talking about Independence, Missouri, although it is the center place of Zion perhaps, but that you're standing on it. And so are you down in South America and Central America. All of that, apparently, according to him, is Zion. We got a really fun paper here. It's a baptismal certificate for Martha Goforth, where Joseph baptizes her and signs the certificate with his own hand. Kind of fun. This is 9th of April, 1844, and it was held in the Goforth family for many years until 1984, when Emerita, great name, Emerita Brown, Martha's great-granddaughter, donated it to the Church Historical Department, which is now called the Church History Library, and it says this: "To whom it may concern, this certifies that I baptized Martha Goforth on Sunday, the 7th day of April, 1844, and confirmed her by the laying on of my hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, given under my hand at the city of Nauvoo this 9th day of April, 1844, Joseph Smith, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." And it seems to be the only baptism that Joseph did on that day, as far as the papers that we have found. But I thought that was kind of fun. That's something you hang on to. Hey, by the way, Joseph Smith the prophet baptized me and confirmed me. Kapow. Put that on your, cross stitch and smoke it. But anyway, we're now back to Harrison Sagers. Remember him? He was guilty of trying to use plural marriage, this whole plural marriage idea to have some illicit relations with some other women. And he was accused of abandoning his wife and children without support. This document that we see is Lucinda Sagers bringing the official accusation, which is followed by William Marks sending the request for him to go to a high council meeting to be dealt with according to church laws. One of the reasons this is interesting is because this is Lucinda's way of publicly denouncing her husband and stating that she is no longer liable for any of his debts or any other things people may call her or her family because of him. So this is her publishing it out and saying, don't come to my house asking for money because of this guy. He is out of my life. So you go, Lucinda. She was like not happy about this whole kerfuffle. Anyway, much to skip. Deeds, licenses, records, so forth. I'm going to plop down on a meeting, though, that we get in the newly dedicated Masonic Hall in Nauvoo on the 11th of April, where the Council of 50 met and did not make as much progress on their constitution as they would have liked. However, they had the ideal in mind that the best elements of democracy mingled with a theocracy was actually the best way to govern. I'll let you decide, but that's what they talked about. Where things get interesting is explained in the historical introduction for volume 14. It says, Joseph Smith also spoke on the role of revelation in a theocracy. Before the morning session adjourned, council members unanimously accepted Joseph Smith as their prophet, priest, and king. Okay. Now that is what it says from the minute book. It says Elder G.A. Smith offered a motion to adjourn, which was overruled. Burn. And then Elder Erastus Snow arose to repeat the expression of Elder George J. Adams at the other evening, for he feels this is to be the happiest moment he ever enjoyed. He feels as though his soul expanded every time we meet. We have never realized the strength and power of the simple expressions of the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. Quote, "Be patient, for I am laying the foundation of a great work," unquote. It may yet be said that we are still laying the foundation of a great work, and I am happy that I have the privilege of associating with our beloved prophet and the members of this council, and prays that I may live as long as Moses. He said he never rejoiced as much as he did today when President Smith was making his remarks. He concluded by offering a motion that this honorable assembly receive from this time henceforth and forever Joseph Smith as our prophet, priest, and king, and uphold him in that capacity in which God has anointed him. The motion was seconded and accepted unanimously. Now, just going to point out here, prophet, priest, and king is almost always just intended for Jesus Christ. We get prophets and priests. King David was one of those. And in this case, you have this whole idea, which sounds very, obviously a bunch of believers and stuff, but there were non-believers in the room. There were non-members in this council at this time. So the fact that they voted for it as well, I just find very interesting, a unanimous vote in the affirmative. All right, so then they adjourned for a little while, and then Joseph kept going on his ideas that revelation and theocracy will be for the benefit of all, especially considering that a few who had entered into the Council of 50 were not members of the church, and that was irrelevant to good society or civil protections. Revelation applies to all. Why not? They continued to discuss what their constitution should be and who should be involved, like Joseph Smith, and to what extent. Now, I found this interesting picture in Documents 14 for Joseph Smith's presidential run. Joseph for president with Sidney Rigdon as vice president. This is sort of all wrapped up in the Council of 50 deliberations. So this is what was actually published and put out there. There's a bit more back and forth about Joseph's views on government with various people. Reports are given, deeds and receipts are given. I wanted to mention a John E. Page letter where John is getting into some scholarly work about Central and South America, Mesoamerican findings, and how it connected back into the Book of Mormon ideas and how it proves, according to him, the book's truth, which is something a lot of saints took an interest in, and they still do. And I believe farms is still a thing. And basically, that is what they focus on, is trying to put the connection of the Mesoamerican peoples, Native American peoples, plus the Book of Mormon together. And FARMS stands for, this is a BYU subsidy organization, I believe, that stands for Foundation of Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. So it's kind of fun to see that even way back in 1844, people are like, oh man, we're seeing stuff in Maya, Aztec, whatever that correlates to the Book of Mormon. Anyway, that was a thing then and it's a thing now. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. I thought that was fun. Joseph's views of government do make some positive impressions out there. So something called the Central Committee of the National Reform Association. My goodness, people. No wonder we make acronyms today. But anyway, this group wrote him a letter on the 20th of April talking about land expansion, public lands, and how they feel land should be distributed, not only just to the rich, but to help everybody build their own wealth. They were interested in his run for president, and they seemed to line up on this topic. So this could have been like, maybe we want to endorse you. Anyway, the Saints published this in the Nauvoo Neighbor, and no known response exists, but, a very interesting collaboration between these two groups. So that's that. It's been a long time, but we do get another unpublished revelation, this time in the Council of 50 Minute Book. So there you go, on the 25th of April, and it says, "Verily thus saith the Lord, ye are my constitution, and I am your God, and ye are my spokesmen. From henceforth do as I shall command you, saith the Lord." One footnote for this in the papers, you only get one. It says, Joseph Smith gave similar instruction at the organizational meeting of the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo on the 17th of March, 1842. Speaking of a proposed presidency for the organization, he stated, quote, "Let this presidency serve as a constitution, all their decisions to be considered law and acted upon as such," unquote. He then expanded this notion of a constitution to include the actions of the organization as a whole, explaining that, quote, "The minutes of your meetings will be precedents for you to act upon, your constitution and law," unquote. Now, I am the amateur historian, but this kind of smacks of like, hey, Supreme Court decisions, right? And we refer back to those on what are we going to do next. So this idea of a council being the Constitution is not truly far-fetched, but probably not something you want to share at the time when the church doesn't have a very good view of, from other people. So anyway, but yeah, you are the Constitution. Some historical introduction goodness. We get this. It says, Joseph Smith made some further remarks and advised that we let the Constitution alone. He would tell us the whole matter about the Constitution. Joseph Smith then wrote a revelation, given in the voice of God, that foreclosed any further drafting or even the idea of a written constitution of the kingdom of God. The revelation stated that the council itself would be the Constitution. This revelation was apparently read to the council. Sidney Rigdon then motioned for the revelation to be accepted by the council. The vote was unanimous, and the council adjourned. So there you go. Let the council decide, and that's your constitution. And whether you're a member of the church or not in this council, they all agreed that that was the way they should go. Very interesting. Sort of a democratic theocracy, and based on councils was their government. So as I said before, Orson Hyde was in Washington, D.C. during this time and tried to get their memorial that they published through to the Senate, which it did, and then died in committee. But this guy put up a good fight and to get this through and get some action on it, but that all basically eventually failed. But he really talks in length in these letters about this is what we're doing, this is who we're meeting with, this is what we're trying to push forward. I'll spare you all the details, but he really put up a good fight for that. Charles Rich then takes command as the second in command of the Nauvoo Legion after William Law is under scrutiny for trying to betray the commanding officer into a mob's hands. That would be a problem, so he tried to get Joseph Smith into a Missouri mob, and so for that he is court-martialed. And while that is being under review, Charles Rich takes over his command that he had. We get more land haggling in Kirtland, more deeds and licenses, so much is skipped, and we come into May of 1844. So we have a few letters explaining more of what was happening in Washington to try to get the memorial to work towards action, as well as a mountain of various papers. But we get a mission report from David Hollister on the 9th of May, which gives an interesting account of a journey on his way to assist in the presidential campaign mission, where a guy actually pulls a knife on him. Of course, the guy's from Missouri. He's on a boat. Anyway, there's a crowd of people come to David Hollister's aid and attempt to throw this guy that pulled a knife on him overboard on the craft they were riding on the river. Anyway, otherwise, they say they were continuing to gain motion for Joseph Smith to run for the president, and Joseph has a number of papers for habeas corpus to continue his fight against the extradition to Missouri. So kind of an interesting little, somebody's trying to knife a missionary on a boat somewhere. It's kind of interesting. All right, we get a letter from Joel Harmon Walker offering his military experience and his education if the memorial was successful in Washington. So he caught wind of this. He says, hey, I've got some experience if you need my help. And Joseph replied to this and said he would totally reach out if the memorial gained traction. Would totally reach out is not a direct quote, just to be clear. He didn't say, I'm going to so totally reach out. We do get a warrant for the arrest of Robert Foster, who was mentioned in section 124 of the Doctrine and Covenants, by the way, on the good side of things, but now he's under arrest. He was recently cashiered from his post in the Nauvoo Legion and excommunicated from the church. The charge states that he, quote, did violently and maliciously assault the said Jonas Kilmer with a brick bat and did threaten to knock him down if he stirred, unquote. So that little bit of violence got him arrested. So we get that. So how we go from a guy that was mentioned in favorable circumstances in section 124, that is not too long ago, to now being jailed for violence is quite nuts. Anyway, we also get a letter from Robert McCorkle, which starts as prose, actually, and then it switches into poetry. Now, Robert never joined the church, but was so impressed by the story of Joseph Smith that he named his son after him. Now, Robert made a trip from Tennessee to Nauvoo, but could not get an audience or meet with Joseph Smith. So instead of that, he writes a letter as kind of a form of complaint that that meeting never happened. And we have no record that he ever joined the church, but I just thought it was interesting. He starts writing, in prose and like, hey, I couldn't meet you. I'm so sad about that. And then he writes a poem about it. So, express yourself in the way you need to express yourself, I say. There are some meetings in the discourse where Joseph continues his teaching that the dead are disembodied spirits who receive the gospel in the spirit world if they didn't receive it here. We therefore must provide all of their ordinances that we receive as the living, so that the living may be saved as well as the dead. So these two things are connected. Back to the series of letters to the presidential candidates, Henry Clay came back with some pity, but suggested that the saints just leave the United States, settle in Oregon Territory somewhere. Joseph very clearly did not respect that response, wrote a very long response, published it in the Nauvoo Neighbor, and the ending of that letter sums up a great deal of the tone of the letter. It says this, quote, I mourn for the depravity of the world. I despise the hypocrisy of Christendom. I hate the imbecility of American statesmen. I detest the shrinkage of candidates for office from pledges and responsibility. I long for a day of righteousness, when he whose right it is to reign shall judge the poor and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And I pray God, who hath given our fathers a promise of a perfect government in the last days, to purify the hearts of the people and hasten the welcome day. With the highest consideration of virtue and unadulterated freedom, I have the honor to be your obedient servant, Joseph Smith, unquote. So, yeah, Joseph's not too impressed with the politicians of his time, and that is some more 19th century insult that I love so much. All right, the next thing that we do get is a letter of reprimand to Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt on the 13th of May because they altered the memorial to Congress by removing that whole part where Joseph becomes the military leader for westbound settlers. They were explicitly instructed not to alter anything in the memorial, and they wrote back an apology. But the Senate made it clear that, it would never pass if that language was included. And basically the Council of 50 said, we don't care, do it anyway. Joseph being, if you don't have that, you might as well not have any of it, is what they say. The last thing we get in Documents Volume 14 is a poem written in Joseph Smith's own hand to somebody by the name of Barbara Neff. Now, this is an autograph book. So people back in 1844 didn't just sign autograph books, they also wrote messages. So Barbara got signatures and messages from a lot of people. She gets one from Leonora Taylor, John Taylor, Brigham Young, Eliza R. Snow, Sidney Rigdon, and W.W. Phelps. And on the same page is something written by Joseph F. Smith. So this book kept going for a while because Joseph F. Smith was not quite old enough to be, doing that sort of thing. That was much later, and I will prove that in a moment. So here is a poem written by Joseph Smith himself in his own hand. Are you ready for this? The truth and virtue both are good when rightly understood, but charity is better, miss, that takes us home to bliss. And so forthwith remember Joseph Smith. Very clever. Forthwith and Smith, you go. And if you're curious, this is the rest of the page. It says here, let truth and virtue hand in hand together shine, and charity them both adore, and all together bow at lovely mercy's shrine. March 14th, 1901, Joseph F. Smith. So, as I said before, this one kept going for a while. All right. Long one perhaps, but there you go. The rest of the history, and we now can shelve Volume 14 of the document series of the Joseph Smith Papers. There you go. I will also say that the administrative records and their revelations and stuff continue going, but we will not be referring to that one anymore. And the very last volume that I'm about to go into is going to be volume 15 of the document series, as well as what we would now call section 135 of the Doctrine and Covenants. That is the announcement of the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. And so, until then, this is the amateur historian signing off and saying, stay with us. We have one more episode to go as we explore the last days of the life of Joseph Smith. And until then, take care of yourself. We'll see you next time on Filling in the History.